Question. Kim, in all your years of spiritual experience, have you ever had doubts in the spiritual path before? You know, like seeing lots of crazy stuff and people in spiritual groups. And all of a sudden you are starting to doubt if this entire New Age and spirituality thing is maybe just a gathering of disillusional people. I might be slightly going through this right now. The statistics of crazy people within spiritual groups seem to be so much higher than many more non-spiritual and normal groups I've been to. The exact same types of human selfishness and dramas too, just under the disguise of spirituality. This is all a little bit disappointing, when in your mind you once thought spiritual people are paragons of human virtues and sincerity. So, have I ever met crazy people on the spiritual path? Well, how much time do you have? No, but seriously, I mean, I think back, I found the spiritual path when I was 18. I got involved with a spiritual movement, and I can exactly recognize what the person asking the question is saying. You have an expectation that spiritual people are going to be nicer and kinder than non-spiritual people. And then you come into a spiritual organization and you realize they are not. And you get disappointed. Of course you get disappointed. So the question is, did you ever have doubts in the spiritual path? And no, I didn't have doubt in the spiritual path, but I did have doubt in spiritual movements. And I still have some question about what it will take to get a spiritual movement to function. But what I have come to, what I actually came to a long time ago, was that I recognized that my disappointment of how spiritual people behave was really based on an unrealistic expectation. Because I expected spiritual people to be different than non-spiritual people. And what realism is there for expecting that? Because what makes people unbalanced or crazy? Well, it's unresolved psychology, right? So why would you assume that because a person discovers a spiritual teaching, a spiritual movement, that they have overcome all of their unresolved psychology? I look back at the 48 years I've been on the spiritual path. And it's not that I can't see what the questioner is saying, that there may be more unbalanced, crazy people in spiritual movements than out in society. But I'm not sure the difference is that big, because I have from time to time been involved with some organizations out there where there also were some very, very unbalanced people. And I think you can see on social media how social media is almost being taken over by the unbalanced people, and the more balanced people just withdraw because they don't even want to mess with it. So I don't really know that it's worse in spiritual movements. But what I will say that I have observed is that there is a certain tendency that spiritual movements attract people who have unresolved psychology. And that's because they are hoping that by engaging in a spiritual movement, it will help them overcome the psychology. So the way I always looked at it, no, not the way I always looked at it, the way I came to look at it after I had processed this for some time, is that you can see many crazy people in the world who are not at all working on their psychology. So at least the crazy people in spiritual movements, they have, at some level of their being, they have a desire to overcome their psychology and reach a higher state of consciousness. So you must credit them that at least they have some awareness that they need to change. Now, when you say that, you also have to recognize that, because the question then is, why are there then people who have been in spiritual movements for a very long time, maybe decades, who haven't overcome certain aspects of their psychology? And, as the questioner also says, why are there people who have actually used the spiritual teaching to solidify their unresolved psychology, maybe even make them believe that this psychology shows that they are sophisticated and therefore they don't need to? So, what I'm saying is, I think most of the people who are unbalanced, who are attracted to spiritual movement, is because they have a certain desire to change. So why don't they? And in my view, my experience, the first thing we need to look at is that, let's just be honest, the spiritual path is not easy, right? It's a fundamental shift, many fundamental shifts. But the thing is, it's like, what is the real goal of spiritual growth is a higher state of consciousness. But this state of consciousness is so different from what we call normal state of consciousness in society that it's just an enormous shift in consciousness. And first of all, you can't expect people to make that shift quickly. It will take time. But second of all, it's not that easy to see what it is. So I think back at the many years, and I see how in the first, I don't know, at least 20 years I was on the spiritual path. I didn't actually grasp how radical of a change in consciousness is required, how radical of a shift is required to reach those higher levels of consciousness that the spiritual teachings I studied were always talking about. I didn't even begin to grasp it. And so this is one thing, it's not easy to grasp it. And because it's not easy to grasp it, there's a phenomenon that you can see in spiritual movements. It is people who, they go into a spiritual movement, they become very, very eager. They study the teaching until they feel they have a good grasp of the teaching. They practice whatever spiritual practice is. They participate in the organization. They might even work for the organization, work to spread the teachings, support the guru in all kinds of ways. And so, but despite all of this, they haven't taken the spiritual teaching and applied it to themselves. And this is partly because it is difficult to grasp how big of a shift in consciousness we're talking about, but it's also because the ego will resist people applying a spiritual teaching to themselves. So there's a phenomenon, you could say that, as I always say, the spiritual path has stages. So the first stage is where you find the spiritual teaching. In the beginning, for many people, there's what I call the exploratory phase. You're just studying all kinds of things. You're into all kinds of things in the New Age phenomenon. Crystals, numerology, astrology, aura readings, whatever. But then many people eventually come to a point where they focus on one spiritual teaching, they commit themselves more. For some people, they find a spiritual teaching, they commit themselves right away. But nevertheless, you make this commitment, and then you really go into a spiritual teaching. And it's possible that these people, I can certainly see, I did this myself for a number of years, I felt I was a really good student because I was really studying this teaching, I was really practicing the spiritual practices, I was willing to engage with the organization, take the courses that were offered, and in other words, I did everything right on the outer. But I just hadn't grasped that the basic element of spiritual growth is resolving psychology. I still thought, by studying the teachings, one day there will come this epiphany, the clouds will part, and I'm in a higher state of consciousness. Or by invoking enough violet flame to transmute my karma, one day I'll be in a higher state of consciousness. Or by taking more advanced meditation courses, one day I'll be. It was still waiting for this miracle instead of looking at myself in the mirror and saying, you have to look at yourself, you have to look at your unresolved psychology and resolve one thing at a time, as I now say, one subconscious self at a time. And so what you see in a lot of spiritual movements is people who have made the commitment, they're doing all the outer things right, but haven't applied the teachings to themselves. They haven't really seen, oh, if my consciousness is to be raised, I'm the one who has to change, and I will not change until I look at myself and my psychology and actively work on that. So what you see in spiritual movement is there's a group of people who are in this state of consciousness where they think they're doing everything right, and they think they can make progress without looking at themselves, their psychology. And they often go into projecting out. They're projecting upon other people. And so what I see as the most common reason for what the questioner is talking about is these people go into this. I have a couple of videos where I talk about the infallibility syndrome, where people think, now I have it all figured out, now I'm a really good student because I've done all of these outer things and I participated in the organization and maybe I have a position in the organization. I know how to walk the path, I know how other people should walk the path, and therefore they become willing to, it's not even that they are seeking to help other people. They're actually projecting upon other people what they should do or what they shouldn't do. And so they become very self-righteous in a way, because they think they're advanced students and they can tell other people. But they do it not really to help other people, they do it to actually build their own sense of importance. And so they often become critical of other people, they talk down to other people, they're not really sensitive to what other people need, they want people to fit into a certain mold of how these people think you should walk the spiritual path. And so they become insistent, forceful, even sometimes aggressive. And what's typical of these people is that if somebody doesn't want to listen to them, doesn't want to follow them, or if somebody, God forbid, challenges them, they become angry or they become upset, and now they want to beat people into submission. And one of the most common ways you see this is quote the guru. In the TM movement, Maharishi said, in the Summit Lighthouse, where the Elizabeth prophet was called Mother, Mother said, or El Moya said, or the master this or the master that said. And so this can lead to a lot of interpersonal conflicts that can spiral out of control sometimes. It's just a phenomenon you see in spiritual movements. And it's a lack of maturity. It's, hopefully something that people will grow out of. Maybe some people don't grow out of it, but the way I've always looked at this is very simple. If I have a reaction to other people, the reaction is in me. So instead of trying to change those other people, I need to look at my own reaction and overcome that reaction. Why do I have the reaction? Now, as I said, I've had doubt in spiritual movements. I've never had a doubt in the spiritual path. And that's because from the moment I found the spiritual path, but maybe this comes from past lives as well, I realized that the spiritual path is a process between me and my higher self and someone up there, which I now see as the Ascended Masters. When I was younger, I didn't know about Ascended Masters. I just sensed there has to be some spiritual being. And the purpose of the spiritual path is to increase my sense of connection with my higher self and with my spiritual teacher. And that connection does not depend on anything here on earth. It doesn't depend on a guru. It doesn't depend on other people in a spiritual movement. There's this saying in the Bible that always stuck with me, let no man take thy crown. What is your crown? Well, it's your connection, your vertical connection to your higher self and your spiritual teachers. You cannot let any man take that away. So you cannot allow yourself to look at a spiritual movement and say, oh, these people are not behaving the way I think they should. This whole thing is nonsense. I'm just going to leave in a huff. If you're doing that, you're allowing your ego to win because you're allowing other people to come between you and God. And you cannot allow anything to come between you and God or spirit. Your higher self, your spiritual teachers. Nothing should be allowed to come between you. And so if you do that, you're sort of also demonstrating that you haven't understood what the spiritual path is really all about. You haven't been willing to look at your own psychology. And you're actually doing what these people are doing. They are projecting their own unresolved psychology on other people, and you're doing the same thing because you are saying, oh, these people can disturb me. It's basically your ego using other people as an excuse for you not looking at the ego. So I realized I just can't do that and make maximum spiritual progress, because if I do that, I'm not making progress, right? Now, what I'm talking about here is not really people who are what you would normally call crazy or who have very dysfunctional psychology. So I'm more talking about people who are, yeah, they have unresolved psychology that are somewhat unbalanced. But I will also say that over my years on the spiritual path, I have run into some people where you have to say they are really extremely unbalanced. And again, I don't know if it's worse than in other aspects of society, but I think even these people that are so unbalanced, they are sometimes attracted to spiritual movements either because they think they can overcome the imbalance, but really most of these people are not willing to look at themselves. So they're not really consciously thinking this. Maybe they have some desire to overcome it, I don't know. But if they don't apply the teachings to themselves, how could that ever happen? So you really have to look at why are these people in spiritual movements. And in some cases, I honestly think it's because their minds are open to some lower forces that are directing these people to go into a spiritual movement just in order to create chaos and in order to discourage other people. Because I have seen people who met some of these crazy people and who just said, that's it, I don't want to have anything to do with spiritual movements. And some people have also, of course, acted out in such extreme ways that they gave the entire spiritual phenomenon a bad name. I mean, you look at popular movies and TV series and how the stereotype is always the cult leader who is being really extreme and telling people to do all these crazy things, and people are just blindly following that leader and they do all kinds of crazy stuff. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but certainly it isn't the typical experience of spiritual movements. So it really is a stereotype, but it's of course based on the fact that there are some people who are really out there. But it's just that, you know, you can find those in other areas of society. I mean, you could go into many large businesses and find crazy people, even sometimes crazy people that are high-ranking officials in those businesses. Does that mean the entire business community should be given a bad name? You know, you can find scientists who are geniuses but are crazy, are acting crazy. Does that mean science should now get a bad name because of these few people? But what am I trying to say with this? Well, I'm trying to say that, again, no matter how crazy people are, you can't let them come between you and your spiritual growth, your personal relationship with your higher self and your spiritual teachers. because it doesn't depend on that. Now, saying that, I know there are people who have come in contact with such clearly unbalanced people, and have been very deeply hurt by it. And so I'm not trying to make light of it. I mean, there are certainly people in spiritual movements who are wreaking havoc and deeply hurting other people, simply because their psychology is so unbalanced. Their self-righteousness has reached an extreme level where they think they can tell other people how to run their path, or tell other people that they are bad people for not obeying them. And there are some that are just, I don't think they are consciously thinking anything. They are just wreaking havoc because they are interrupting proceedings, taking over the conversation, criticizing other people, criticizing the leader, criticizing the teaching, all kinds of things. I mean, I have seen a fair amount of these kind of imbalances. I have, seen people who come into a spiritual movement and they profess they want to support you, but then when you don't give them the sense that they are so special, they just knife you in the back and, try to destroy you psychologically. I mean, there are all kinds of crazy things that happen there. And I know that there are many people who have been hurt by this, and I feel for them. I'm not trying to make light of this, but I am just trying to say that for me, it's always been this, the benefits of the spiritual path have been so tangible for me that it's worth it to deal with whatever you have to deal with. And as I said, once you have experienced your connection to a higher self, your connection to the Ascended Masters, it's so much better than anything that happens on earth that you get this sense that you just can't let anything interfere with that. And I know some people say, well, what if I haven't experienced that? Then, and I understand that, then it's more difficult. You can't just decide. But I still think I think you need to ask yourself what the spiritual path is about, and really come to that point where you realize that your reaction to other people shows that you have unresolved psychology, and the way for you to grow is to resolve that psychology. So you come to a point where these people don't matter to you anymore. You just don't have a reaction to them. You're not letting them derail your spiritual path, but you're not even being disturbed by it. They are just irrelevant to you. One of the things, I guess maybe it's just my psychology that's that way, because I remember when I was a child, obviously I was exposed to a fair amount of other children, especially boys, for some reason it's mostly boys, who love teasing other children. And I realized that since I was going to school, there was no way I could avoid encountering these people who would try and tease me. But I also realized that they only tease people, well, of course they tease people because of the unresolved psychology, but I wasn't really aware of that when I was 7 years old. But they tease other people to get something out of it. And I realized that if you don't let them get anything out of teasing you, they'll stop teasing you and find somebody else. So when they tried to tease me, I just either wouldn't respond, or I would just make light of it, or I would make fun of myself, because if you can make fun of yourself, then other people can't really get pleasure out of making fun of you, right? You're not being negatively affected by them making fun of you if you can make fun of yourself. And so I'm just saying, I always had this in my psychology, when I sense that other people have a specific intention of manipulating me or hurting me, there's always something in me that says, you're not going to get away with this. And therefore I'm willing to look at, what does it take that they can't get away with it? It takes that I look at my psychology and say, why am I reacting to this? Why does this matter to me? I mean, I have briefly mentioned in some other videos that I had a situation in 2009-10 where I separated from my second wife, and she and some people that followed her, they were trying to do everything they could to destroy me psychologically by using the internet and posting all kinds of things that had no bearing in fact whatsoever. And it's not that I wasn't affected by it, but I realized from the very beginning, you can't respond to it. You can't defend yourself. You can't even point out that what they're doing is wrong. Because it will just propagate the spiral. And this is what you see in spiritual movements. You know, two people get into conflict, and now they start this spiral of attacking each other and justifying it by using the spiritual teachings, drawing other people into it, and this and that. And I just realized I just had to turn the other cheek and not respond to it at all. But then I also realized that I needed to look at my reaction to this. And I've said before that one of the things I discovered was I had this very strong desire to be seen as a good person, the prince on the white horse. And here they were accusing me of being everything but that. And so I had to say, well, where does this come from? And it came from a subconscious self. And when I saw it and let go of it, I could look at what these people were saying about me, and I had no reaction to it. What does it matter? And this is, to me, it was always, I realized that this is where I need to get to on a spiritual path, where other people's reactions to me don't disturb me. It doesn't mean that I don't care about people, but when people are deliberately negative, and they're deliberately crazy, or they're deliberately trying to destroy you, you just have to make yourself invulnerable to it, because, as Jesus said, the prince of this world comes and has nothing in me. And so that's always been my sort of guiding line, as I've said before with the Buddha, you know, overcome your attachments. And if you, I'm sure you can find examples of spiritual movements who have basically been destroyed by these very unbalanced people. I'm sure you can find that. They are certainly, I have myself seen how spiritual movements can be negatively affected by them because they create all kinds of conflicts. Or maybe they just interrupt things and create chaos. So, you know, as I said, I have had my doubts in whether a spiritual movement is really sustainable. And I think the only way that it can be sustainable is if people are very aware of psychology. Because what happens in a lot of spiritual movements is this, it's again this, the infallibility syndrome, because you think, we have this advanced guru who's giving us advanced teaching, we have this spiritual technique, if you just keep using the technique, one day you will poof, you will be awakened. And so you really can't deal with problems head on. You can't acknowledge problems and talk about them. So you try to ignore them, hoping they'll go away, hoping these people will leave, hoping that one day they'll be transformed and they'll go away. But I think the only way you could really have a more mature spiritual movement is if you were willing to talk about things and really talk about psychology. If you had a movement where the most people were not seeking to hide behind a facade, they were not pretending, they were willing to look at their psychology, they were based on it. Therefore, if somebody comes in with clearly unbalanced psychology, you can call it right away. You can call it what it is. And you can be willing to confront people and say, do you want to do what the rest of us are doing? Because if not, you should go find yourself some other spiritual movement where you can do whatever you want to do, because we're not going to allow you to do it here. And if people are then willing to change, then you can work with them and offer them all kinds of help to overcome their psychology. But if they're not willing to change, you just need to filter them out and say, you don't belong here. This is not our. This is not your kind of spiritual movement. then you probably would be able to have some. But that requires a certain level of willingness to look, that people have to be willing to look at their own psychology. Because Jesus said it very well 2,000 years ago. He said, why are you looking at the splinter in your brother's eye and you don't see it as a beam in your own eye? First, remove the beam in your own eye. Then you will see clearly how to remove the splinter in your brother's eye. And that's what these unbalanced people are not willing to do. So if you have a spiritual movement, and most people have worked on their own psychology, then they can very quickly identify when somebody comes in and says, oh yeah, there's a person with unbalanced psychology. And if they start acting out, you can then say, okay, this is it. You want to fit in here, you do what the rest of us do. If not, you go somewhere else. So, did that make any sense, what I'm saying here? Well, for me, the bottom line was always this. I am responsible for my own spiritual path. And if I allow somebody else to cause a reaction in me, this is my responsibility to overcome that, so that other people can't discourage me, take me off the path, cause me to be angry, cause me to doubt, all these kind of things. Because the spiritual path is about my relationship to my higher self and my spiritual teachers. And it doesn't depend on anything here on earth. It will, of course, depend on my psychology. So that's why I'm saying if people are causing a reaction in me, it's a chance for me to look at my unresolved psychology, because that psychology will also block my connection, right? You could say, let no man take that crown. In other words, don't let other people interfere with you, but don't let your own psychology interfere either. And the only way other people can interfere is actually by stirring up your unresolved psychology. So again, if you remove that beam from your own eye, you will see clearly, both in a vertical direction and in a horizontal direction.